Chapter 17. Birds of a Feather. Rosie was born in 1922, lived through the Great Depression into her teens, nursed her ailing mother with tuberculosis, and because of that was forced to drop out of school in the 8th grade. She got married when she was 15 to a 26-year-old German-American man, raised one son and 3 daughters in absolute poverty, escaped a dangerous situation in Texas, and then moved to Colorado where she met Joe. Her previous husband divorced her, and then she married Joe. She had 2 more boys with Joe when she was in her late 30s. She traveled with her new family 1,700 miles in an old beat-up 57 Ford pickup to British Columbia, Canada, and moved many times after that. Rosie got the first job she ever had outside the home in an apple packing shed in Oroville. She became clinically depressed and battled all kinds of illness, and tried her best to protect and educate her 2 young sons. In 1969, she went to night school and earned her high school diploma when she was 47 years old. She was not consciously aware of the fact that she had been awoken by the autism researchers. Nevertheless, she continued to want to run far away whenever she recognized the old autism researcher in her midst. For this reason, Rosie became obsessed with moving again just 2 years after arriving in Oroville. She told Joe more vehemently every morning and night that it was time to move again. She could not name the source of her fear, not being able to consciously remember seeing the old watcher. But Joe had reached an end to his ability to keep running with her. He coldly and flatly refused to ever move again. Rosie could not budge him in the slightest. When Steve was young, he used to feel embarrassed by his mother at times. As he matured and woke up himself, he saw his mother's life and actions with much more clarity. The backwards, uneducated, overprotective hick woman he could now clearly see was a more powerful, creative, intelligent, and brave person than he could understand. Well, he had been sleepwalking for more than 40 years. Rosie followed a tradition in her family line: hide, fight, and flee, in continuous cycle, a common trait in all members of the new species. Today, these new people are wrongly labeled with ASD, Autistic Spectrum Disorder. There is no disorder involved. When Joe could not be moved, Rosie concocted resentment and jealousy, falsely claiming that she knew he was having an affair with the boss's wife. Joe just laughed at her and coldly denied it. In a few more months, she had worked herself up into a paranoid frenzy. One day she told her 2 sons she was leaving their father and taking them with her. In another month she did exactly that, leaving Joe in the lurch and once again completely disrupting her sons' lives. The insanity that unfolded for those 3 is the subject of another story. Joe grieved the loss of his family and stayed on with the Simons, becoming their ranch foreman. He occasionally received letters from Steve and Clyde. When Rosie moved back to that little town years later, begging Joe to take her back, he replied to her letters with one-word replies: no. Chapter 18. Pernicious Anemia. Joe became weaker and weaker as the years wore on. By age 65, he had become so weak he could not work more than about 2 hours a day and looked white as a sheet. His boss finally demanded that Joe get in his pickup truck. Joe could barely comply. Then he drove Joe to a hospital emergency room 40 miles south. A doctor took one look at Joe and thought he must have end-stage bone cancer or some other terminal condition. He ran cancer screening tests and a battery of further tests, but found nothing wrong. This the doctor found confusing, because he had never seen a patient with such a low white blood count, except for AIDS patients when they were dying. He ordered Joe kept in isolation, which is exactly how Joe had been living out on the ranch. A common cold could have killed him. After consulting with 2 other doctors, he reluctantly came to the conclusion that Joe might have something quite simple, such as pernicious anemia, the inability of the human digestion tract to process the B12 vitamin from food. He ordered Joe to have an IV drip that included massive amounts of processed B12 vitamins. Joe immediately started getting back into the pink. Joe never wrote to any of his few friends, and less family, those who were still living. If one or two people had the temerity to write to him, he would always write at least a short note back in his simple draftsman's print in ballpoint pen. Steve was not surprised that his father never even sent a postcard alerting anyone to his health crisis. Steve drove his old daddy across the snow-packed pass, inviting him to live with him and his wife to help Joe with his recovery and get his strength back. Joe was barely able to walk, had a very short attention span, and probably should have still been in hospital. With Steve and his wife's assistance, Joe quickly regained his health and started to get some strength back. Within 3 months, he was back in the pink and ready to get back to work on the Simon Ranch. He looked 20 years younger. He had such a compromised immune system that he ended up having to get childhood vaccinations again. He suffered through chicken pox, the mumps, and also experienced some good consequences. He had not been able to eat green salads for years because of a problem with severe heartburn. However, his rejuvenated body had no problems digesting salad. Steve drove him back over the mountains in the early spring. Joe became the ranch foreman that he had been, working for several more years before finally retiring at age 70. Joe was 50 years old when he came to the Okanagan Valley of eastern Washington, although he and his family had little hope for the future until Rooster Simon showed up at the hotel one night. Rooster agreed to try Joe for a week and said if it was any good, he would give him a full-time job. Rooster was very impressed with Joe and offered him the job in only a few days. It turned out to be the best job Joe ever had. Joe finally achieved his dream of complete isolation, as he often said, "Stay the hell away from people." Most of the year he worked alone with trained cow dogs about 50 miles from the main ranch. His task was keeping the cattle safe and fed in a leased 150 square mile area of the Okanagan National Forest rangeland. It was located in the foothills of the Cascades, east of Tonasket, Washington, and north of Republic, Washington. He lived there at the place called Cow Camp on some maps, in a one-room, tin-roofed cabin with no electricity, no running water, and only a wood cook stove for heat, hot water, and cooking. Situation normal. Before Rosie left Joe, taking the 2 boys with her, she lived with Joe and the boys in the one-room cabin for 1 summer. She never agreed to go back. So Joe alternately lived there with Steve and then with Clyde for a few weeks at a time in the summer for a few more years. He taught them both to rope and ride, build strong barbed wire fences, and how to clear trails. When Rosie moved the boys back to Colorado and then Texas over 3 years, Joe did not see his sons. He became bone-tired with loneliness over the next 2 decades of living 9 months of the year every year at cow camp. After his recovery from pernicious anemia, his outlook changed. That is when he experienced an overwhelming desire to retire and find some way to reinvent himself. He started openly admitting to friends and family that the isolation at cow camp became too much, driving him to become much more sociable. He bought a small house in Oroville and an old pickup truck to haul firewood and to get around. Joe had always lived in a house on a ranch and driven whatever vehicle his bosses supplied to him. He had spent very little of his savings, which more than covered the cost of both the house and the vehicle. He became the darling of the Oroville Senior Center. In fact, he developed a series of romances around helping to operate that senior center. He lived to be 91 years old, outliving Rosie by 16 years, and he never forgot Old Zino, nor the lessons the old Mexican-American had taught him. The end.